Hi, I'm Sheila Kuehl. Welcome to Get Used to It. Today we are going to talk about a topic that I think maybe some other people are also talking about, but maybe not quite in this way, and that is the new administration. Yes, no surprise, but since we talk on Get Used to It about issues of interest to the gay and lesbian community, or about the gay and lesbian community, that's going to be part of what we talk about today, though not solely. And so all I did was invite three of the smartest people I know, and we're going to spend an hour talking about the new administration. My first guest, Torie Osborn, longtime activist in the gay and lesbian community, women's community, civil rights community, is now the executive director of the Liberty Hill Foundation here in Los Angeles County. Welcome, Torie.
Glad to be here.
John Heilman, who is the mayor pro tem of the city of West Hollywood and a law professor. Welcome, John.
Thanks for having us.
You bet. And Tom Soto, who is the president of PS Enterprises, longtime gay and lesbian activist, longtime environmental activist, and an advisor to the Gore campaign. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you for having me.
Torie, let's start with you. It's a big difference from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration. A big turnover, a big ideological change. How do you see those changes manifesting themselves? Primarily about our community, but anything you want to talk about. I mean, you were in the Oval Office, put together, I think, the first group of gay and lesbian community activists that ever met with a president who was in office at the time. What do you think?
Well, I think it's going to be a big change, and I think there's lots of specifics. I mean, for all of the fits and starts and ups and downs of the gays community's relationship with President Clinton, I mean, you know, he sold us out on a few things, but the bottom line is that history will always link gay and lesbian rights moving to a new level of visibility, and I think power, because he sent a green light when he spoke, you know, at that Los Angeles meeting in May of 1992, and he said, you know, I have a vision of America and you are part of it, and said it to the gay and lesbian community. It was words we had been waiting for decades to hear from a national politician, and he followed through. For all of the ways that we have criticized the president, it wasn't just in appointments, it wasn't just in an executive order, it wasn't just in showing up at the right, you know, HR, human rights campaign events, it wasn't just the access to the Oval Office that some of us had. It really was sending out a different message. And to me, the most significant change will not be the appointments that aren't made, the executive orders that don't happen. It will be the lack of our issues being on the public agenda. I heard this morning on the radio, I actually heard a fellow, the leader, I didn't catch his name, but the leader, or a leader from the Christian Coalition talking, and he said, and I quote, he said, "What excites us about George Bush isn't just the changes in social policy." He said, "It's the music that will be playing underneath and behind the political stage for the next 4 years." Now, in that music, we heard gay lyrics and gay and lesbian ideas and values and just visibility in the last 8 years as we never had before. So to me, it's about the narrowing of political space, not just for our community, for so many communities, but the narrowing of the space for justice, for expanding, you know, the very meaning of democracy. I mean, that's my thing these days, is that I think, you know, over the long arc of this country's history, and I agree with Martin Luther King that the arc of justice goes forward. We have, you know, steps backward and steps forward, but overall it's about invigorating and expanding what democracy and justice mean. And under the last 8 years, with some problems, absolutely, for the most part, the gay and lesbian issue, values, and community has been put forward with the Oval Office's help, not despite, not just the movement, you know, our own social movement for equality, but with help with the moral authority and with the voice and visibility of the president. That will stop dead. We will be put on the defensive, the space will be narrowed. I hope chronic discouragement doesn't set in. I'm as interested in the ordinary folks who are, you know, poor and struggling, who aren't necessarily just the leaders who won't be going to those Christmas parties in the White House, as I and you and others were lucky enough to do. It's not just that. It's really about social policy, but the music behind it, the values, the vision, and the sense of how far, you know, how open we can be. I'm telling you, you can measure social progress of the gay and lesbian community by how out of the closet, how many more people are coming out of the closet in more spheres of their lives. And the last 8 years has been an extraordinary coming out, and I call it coming home to America, of this community and its voices, its multiple voices. That is going to just be, the door is going to be shut.
Well, not just that, but we stand to lose things too. I mean, there's sort of in my mind, there's like two major areas that I'm looking at. It's like, and this is not just us, this is civil rights, this is the environment, this is anything that we called gains over the past 8 years. What do we have at the moment that we stand to lose? And some of those are specifics. You talked about the executive order that bars discrimination in any of these federal appointments, you know, on the basis of sexual orientation. I'm sure that gets unraveled in a heartbeat. And the other half is sort of what you've also been talking about, is the loss of momentum. What do we stand not to gain that we might have gained, you know, in the next 4 or 8 years?
Well, I mean, I think it's going to be a time of setbacks and creativity. Now, on the positive side, you know, I believe in social movements. I believe that that long-term social change doesn't happen just, you know, from an individual president. In fact, the reason that Clinton was so much on our side was that we were the major civil rights movement of the 1980s and the 1990s, and that the force of our voice and the force of our movement and how many people were active and activist in workplaces and in community centers and, you know, all over the country put the issue forward so that Bill Clinton had to listen. And, you know, I believe in building movements. I believe that what it's really about, that long-term social change is really about, it doesn't happen first in the electoral arena. It happens in the electoral arena because people outside the electoral arena are organized and mobilized to put their issues forward. And that's what I think we're going to have to do. It actually means that the work that, you know, that I'm doing at Liberty Hill and that others of us do on the activist and kind of, you know, institutional reform and social policy and movement building levels is going to have to increase. We're going to have to get more aggressive about the media advocacy. We're going to have to get smarter to get our messages out. We may have to go back into direct action or some sort of more visible forms of, you know, who knows what, civil disobedience or whatever. But I'm just saying we're going to have to be building our strength from the ground up, building the movements outside again, so that when Al Gore gets in 4 years, or the Democrats get back in 8 years, or whenever the heck it happens, that we've rebuilt our issues and our power, our political power, so we can move it forward again. But there's no question we're going to be on the defensive. And that loss of momentum, I think, you know, it's a depressing time in that sense, but I think it will force us to be more creative. I take a positive view of it, that we'll learn from it, as we did under Reagan.
That's right. We've been through it, although, I mean, the difference is we organize and the door is shut. And we don't get in.
I want to just a piece of history here. In 1980, when Ronald Reagan came into power, 1/2 of the Gay and Lesbian Center in Los Angeles's staff was laid off because they were paid for by grants under the CETA program, which was a Jimmy Carter Democratic jobs training program for community activists. A wonderful program, by the way. But it was government money, and the minute Reagan came to office, of course, he cut all those programs that supported good community services, and 1/2 of the center staff lost their jobs. That was the bad news. The good news was it forced the Gay and Lesbian Center to institute the very first major donor fundraising program, building up its private fundraising that, of course, became then a model for many other gay and lesbian organizations, and forced a much more diversified, you know, and much more organizational sophistication in how we built organizations. So I believe people respond to, you know, crisis with creativity, and that's what we're going to have to do. But it is a challenge.
So, John, you've spent a lot of your life working for civil rights, teaching about civil rights, and in elective office, which is always an interesting combination, as we both know. Not just in terms of W becoming our president or having become our president if you're watching a rerun, but also the cabinet. How do you see any impact not only on our community, but sort of in the broader issues, you know, choice and civil rights, etc.?
I think it's very troubling, and I want to just reiterate something what Torie was saying, that the discussion under Bill Clinton, even when we were losing battles, our issues were being talked about. And I think Clinton was probably one of the first and only presidents who really understood the gay and lesbian community, viewed us as a significant partner in his efforts to move the country forward. We're not going to have that under W or under a Bush administration. It's just not going to happen. I think it's clear already that the people that he is choosing as his cabinet and as his leadership group, they're people who have either been hostile to gay and lesbian concerns or certainly have been silent on it. I really view the next couple of years under a Bush administration one where our issues are going to be, there's going to be deafening silence out of the administration. And it's clear that he is uncomfortable even meeting with people from the gay and lesbian community. His father never mentioned gay and lesbian issues throughout his tenure. And Reagan, of course, they weren't able to even say AIDS during the crisis, the epidemic that we were going through. So I think that what we're really looking for or looking at is 4 years of really no progress at all, a lot of backtracking in places where we thought we had had gains. Clinton, for all of his problems and all of the controversy over gays in the military, I mean, you look at the record that he had on gay and lesbian issues, his advocacy for hate crimes legislation, his advocacy for ENDA and non-discrimination on behalf of gays and lesbians, his executive orders, his appointments. I mean, fighting the battle for Roberta Achtenberg, fighting for James Hormel as an ambassador. I mean, you're not going to see that from George Bush.
Quite the opposite, probably.
Quite the opposite. In fact, I think to some degree it's a litmus test that he has. If you're at all pro-gay or supportive of gay and lesbian issues, you're not going to be part of his administration. The appointments that he's made, just some of them are very troubling for gay and lesbian issues. Ashcroft has had a history of antagonism towards any kind of civil rights legislation, particularly anything involving gays and lesbians. Norton, his Interior nominee, she too has been antagonistic towards gay and lesbian concerns. And I think that you're really looking at George Bush, who portrayed himself as a moderate during the election, now having to reward the conservative right wing with appointments that will satisfy their concerns. He has, and I'll give him credit for this, he's created a veneer of diversity. He at least has a diverse group of faces up there. And I think that's progress for the country. Even a conservative like George Bush recognizes that you're not going to go forward with an administration with all white male faces up there. So that is progress, but their viewpoints, very conservative across the board. And I think it's telling that Ashcroft has a 100% rating from Pat Robertson's Christian Coalition. We know through history that the people who are anti-choice, who are aligned with groups like that, have always been antagonistic towards gay and lesbian
Well, this is a guy
concerns.
that Time magazine said that his record on civil rights issues was, quote, horrendous, close quote. I don't think I've ever seen Time magazine use any words like that. I mean, generally they're more Pablum-esque, you know, in their language, and this was, that's very telling to me too. And Norton, I think it's interesting in Colorado, every attorney general has to defend the law of the state when it's being challenged, but they don't have to look like they're so passionately defending it, and she did. I mean, she was incredibly strong about it. When Roy Romer, the governor of Colorado, was the chair of the anti-Amendment 2 campaign, even though he was the one being sued, you know, and that she was defending. So I think we have a lot to worry about there.
Well, and she actually solicited briefs from other attorneys generals from across the country to try to get them on her side. So it'd be one thing if you went in there and defended, as you have to do as attorney general, but she seemed very eager to defend that ordinance in, or the Amendment 2 in Colorado, and I certainly don't view her as a friend of the gay and lesbian community. But more importantly, for the position she's tapped for, her viewpoints on environmental issues, I mean, I don't think gay and lesbian people or any other people in the country want to see our national parks and national monuments opened up to oil drilling and mining. And these are sacred places for all of us, not just the gay and lesbian
she said
community.
the polluters will police themselves.
Right.
What do we have to worry about? I mean, really horrendous.
Yeah, and when you look at his appointments, and he comes into office with no legitimacy. He campaigned as a passionate conservative, that he was going to try to be a uniter, not a divider. But the people he has chosen are all people who are, for the most part, very extreme in their viewpoints. Probably the only true moderate is Christine Whitman in the selection group. And they've kept her as far away from any kind of social issues as possible, putting her in the EPA where her record isn't that strong. So I'm very troubled from not only gay and lesbian concerns, but from general civil rights. Why would you put somebody in charge of civil rights who has consistently opposed civil rights legislation?
Well, there's a good reason. I mean, we're hiring the foxes to staff the hen houses, and it seems like very obvious choices to do that. That is an agenda, and the agenda it comes out of the message, and the message from the appointments is we're putting people here who will make certain that those, I would call it, gains made in terms of civil rights or protection of the environment will not only stop but will be rolled back. That's the agenda, and therefore the cabinet is absolutely appropriate as appointments for that agenda. I mean, you hire a guy that lost his election in Missouri, even his own state, you know, wouldn't want him to run the state, and the only thing that you can be saying is, look, he was wonderful on anti-choice issues. I want him there to make certain that those are rolled back. But the thing that disturbs me, when Torie was talking about the loss of not just momentum, but the fact that you start to get depressed, you know, it seems to me like the community is already almost making excuses for some of these appointments, like, oh, well, not as bad, you know, he won't be as bad as you think.
Well, I think there is that sentiment among some people in the community, but I also see a lot of people who are tremendously energized by what happened in the election results and the machinations to get him the presidency. And when he signaled that his favorite justices were Justice Thomas and Scalia, the two justices that are most hostile to civil rights and certainly to anything involving gays and lesbians. I mean, I think that energized a lot of people, and I think a lot of people are looking to become more active and to be more involved. Yeah, it's easy to sit back and be depressed, but I think, as Torie said, we've got to be working at the local level, we've got to be working at the state level to re-energize our communities, because the progress that we've made over the years, Bill Clinton was tremendous, but he was tremendous because we enabled him to be tremendous, because we've been out in the workplace, we've been working in organizations, people know us now. It's not as easy, it's not acceptable to be as bigoted as it once was. And I think no matter what Bush does, it is still, the history is on our side. We're going to continue to move forward. We're not going to have to fall back. We're not going to get much progress out of George Bush. If Al Gore was elected, I think we could see real progress with ENDA being enacted and signed into law. It's not going to happen under a Bush administration. He's not going to push for it. And his selection for vice president should have clued us in. Cheney is extraordinarily conservative. His positions on environmental issues, his positions on civil rights issues, he has demonstrated throughout his tenure an extraordinary conservative bent on everything, particularly on gay and lesbian issues. So we should have known prior to the election that that's what it was going to be like.
Well, we probably did know, but many of us didn't think that he was going to win, and you know, now we are dealing with it. Well, everybody's mentioned environmental issues, Tom, and that, of course, has been your forte for so many years. And it seems to me, I could be wrong, that so much of environmental protection really does stem directly out of law, out of the enactments of law, out of agency regulations, etc. How do you see this new administration shaping up
and
on those
executive
issues?
orders through things
Right.
like the Federal Antiquities Act? I think it's we're going to have a profound and unprecedented coalition that gets built as a result of the Bush administration coming in. And it's going to be in response to a lot of the record that is it's not even light. It's so obvious and entrenched. We know where these people are coming from. You're looking at an administration that looks as though it's a Fortune 10 oil company. You have George W. Bush, W for Wildcatter, from Texas. You have Dick Cheney, former executive for Halliburton, who cashed out at $30–40 million to run as his party's nominee. And then you have Condoleezza Rice sits on the board of Chevron, and the list goes on and on and on. So there is absolutely no question that there are going to be solid and true and passionate attempts to derail a lot of the progress that we made in the environmental community, which is not just, you know, the concern of environmentalists. As we all know, I think, you know, many of us here met in the 1980s on other movements other than just gay and lesbian rights. And, you know, some of our key appointees in the White House, you know, helped to serve in the Department of Interior and EPA. I myself was appointed by the President to sit on the Border Environment Commission, which regulates the multi-billion-dollar North American Development Bank. And yet what we're going to see is a lot of that attempted to be unraveled. The other effect that I think is going to say, and you talked to this a little bit, Sheila, is there's a collective grieving going on in our community. And I think a lot of it is going to affect the level of spiritualism that we've been able to generate and build momentum within our community, but also in most communities that are impacted by the benefits and the decisions that have been made by the Clinton-Gore administration. And those are the low-income communities, the communities of color, gays and lesbians, of course. But what we're going to find now is a coalition that will involve all of those groups. I remember back in 1985, during the height of the Reagan-Bush era, when we were all organized against several things. Nuclear arms, we had pro-peace, a great nuclear disarmament, remember that peace march and so forth, and then we had the Contra wars going on not only in Nicaragua and El Salvador, but also in the halls of Congress, and we were blockading you know, some of the most busiest streets in front of the federal building. These were issues that affected the community not in Los Angeles and throughout the country because we saw from a spiritual point of view that these were not things that we could connect to from a values-based point of view as a country. How can we support pointing missiles at one another that could destroy the earth 14 times over? How can we support an administration that was allowing the death and the murder of Maryknoll nuns in El Salvador and so forth? I wouldn't be surprised if we see a repeat of much of that type of antagonism, as John had pointed out, and we're going to have to respond with an unprecedented coalition. And Torie's right, back in the 1980s, our movement was very different than it is now. We now have a very solid and a much more sophisticated political and organizing and funding base. And I don't think that we will take too many months into this administration to wait for many of those policies to be implemented, much less discussed. And I think that the nomination process and the confirmation process is going to be a little bit more time-consuming than W thought. In terms of strictly environmental issues, I don't even want to hazard to guess, but you know, how much time do we have? I mean, where do you start? Because you could talk about wetlands, you could talk about the Arctic National Wildlife Reserve and the northern slopes, we could talk about forestry. There's already discussion in the Beltway about what W is going to do to try to referendum or undo a lot of the federal antiquities acts that really irritated some folks like Orrin Hatch with the Grand Escalante staircase monument, the sequoias and so forth. We're also going to have to look and turn to our local leaders that are solidly entrenched. They have their own mandates at the state level in the California legislature or Governor Gray Davis. Right. Those folks that actually came in because people actually voted, we counted them, and now they're there representing our interests. This is not that administration, and we're going to have to put a very diverse and effective coalition, which, you know, I'm looking forward to seeing that part, because that really adds to, you know, the spiritual connection to the cause that we have. And it also opens up the eyes of what we sometimes find to be a very segregated activist community. I'm concerned about gay and lesbian rights. I'm concerned about well, guess what? We're going to have to be concerned about everyone's issue, because we're all in the same family. We're all going to get, you know, thrown on the outside of this whole administration, and our interests will not be protected. The other thing that we could look at are things within the marine environments across California, the East Coast, and the Gulf. You know, there has been a number of attempts to open up our shorelines to offshore oil drilling, and you know, it's interesting to see how the direction is going to take it with respect to that type of national policy and international policy, because there have been discussions about that possibility in the future. We remember during the early 80s when they started to build oil platforms, they made sure that they built them in the Santa Barbara Channel, and we also made sure that you couldn't see them from Ronald Reagan's ranch. Are we going to do the same thing again here? So there's a number of issues out there. Now we have our nominees. You know, they all sit on these boards, these corporate boards. They're oil interests. They get it. They understand how to manipulate prices and so forth. And now we're going to have these folks provide some degree of leadership, not legitimate in my opinion, to lead the country toward a stable economy, hopefully a prosperous one, but you know, who's to say? And also one that will affect the environment the least as possible. And I don't think that they're even going to be enthusiastic about that.
Well, you know, it's interesting. Our community is often characterized by the other side as, you know, as rich or privileged or special rights. And yet many of us have been working in areas, I mean, like, you know, just as you do, Torie, and you both have as well, in terms of concern about other communities,
Sure,
picking up from your point, Tom, and you know, not just communities of color, but all impoverished communities, which was one of the reasons why I was so concerned about Tommy Thompson's nomination for HUD. I mean, this was the engineer of the welfare deform,
right,
you know, in his state, and a brand new report has just indicated that, oh yeah, there's fewer people on welfare, but they're not making any more money, and oftentimes less, and they're in worse shape than they were when they were getting any kind of government benefits. So he advertised himself as doing this sort of humane thing, get those women to work. What they really want to do is, you know, go to work. And many of us in other states have tried to kind of buttress this plan that captured everybody's imagination with at least some child care, at least some training money, at least it counts that you're going to school, try to humanize it. But it looks to me like he's also you know, a disastrous choice, not to mention the education chief from Houston.
Well, I don't think you could take the type of standards that we have been living up to through the Clinton administration and begin to apply. I mean, if we do that, obviously we're going to be very, very disappointed. And even when you look at the administration that you had, I mean, you have issues with Tommy Thompson. I mean, we have a president that while he was in office, hate crimes went up 70%. How are we going to justify that when we have someone like Ashcroft being nominated as a chief law enforcement officer for the country, a man who is regularly quoted in white supremacist magazines, who is seen as the single greatest obstacle to civil rights in some people's minds, who no, the voters of Missouri wouldn't have him. He lost against a dead man, and you know, now he's going to be our AG. So I think that you're absolutely right, but when we look at this administration, it really is going to be cut in several areas. It's going to be very, very distinct and clear that this was the historical point where we started to go back on things like environmental protection, civil rights, gay and lesbian rights, and quite frankly, again, I'm a big believer in our ability as a community, not of faith-based, but of spiritually based, that understanding the spiritual value of things like environmental protection and having protected resources, or even urban parkland and open space for our children in the inner city. or gay and lesbian rights, or the right to choose. These are things that are spiritually based values that are going to be completely and entirely absent from this administration. Hence gives us the ability to capture a lot of that energy and throw it into a very multicultural, very diverse movement that, quite frankly, we'll just take to the streets again, like we've done before and before and before. We'll do it again. And I think that we're going to have a voice that will, quite frankly, be effective in being able to stop a lot of the policies. But clearly, you know, my head is still spinning by seeing the backgrounds of some of these nominees. It's scary.
Well,
I was just going to say, I mean, the poll after poll shows that there's actually an enduring majority, between 60 and 70% of Americans, who favor pro-choice, non-discrimination for gays and lesbians and anybody else, a strong public education system, environmental protections, and expansion. There is actually a coalesced set of value-based social policies that most Americans believe in. I mean, that's just what the polls say. The problem has been that under 20 years or 12 years of Reagan-Bush, and then Clinton fighting as best as he could on some issues and sort of having to work against an incredible consolidation of power by the right wing in this country. I mean, from 1980 on, the most powerful, the agenda has been set by the radical right, not the moderates. The entire political discourse has moved so far to the right. I mean, liberal became a bad word practically overnight in this country. And there's been a fragmentation. I mean, some of this, I think, is just kind of history and the way that things happen, and I believe the gods kind of, you know, that things happen as, to some extent, as they're meant to be. But I do think that what we're looking at now is, as Tom was saying, there was this fragmentation of different movements. I mean, some of us have crossed over and worked on other issues for many, many years, but a lot of people have come up and come out in the last 20 years where the gay movement has been coming into its own and haven't perhaps worked on environmental, but they're no different than the majority of Americans. They may not have been enviro activists, but they certainly share that set of beliefs. And in fact, gay and lesbians in general are proved to be progressive across the board on almost every issue, including some of the economic policy issues. That people tend to categorize the gay community as rich and, you know, conservative on economic issues. That isn't, in fact, the case. In fact, we're pretty much, you know, with kind of mainstream Americans. I think the real, as Tom put forward, I think the real interesting question is going to be, if we can overcome some of that fragmentation, if some of the people that have been working on choice and the people who have been working, rebuild the coalition, there have been little bits of coalition, and AIDS activists and pro-choice activists, you know, those ACT UP people were out there in front of those clinics, and those pro-choice women were out there at ACT UP, and there have been a few remarkable coalitions under the Reagan-Bush years, and I think we've seen, you know, some of that over the last 8 years, but there's going to have to be, and it's interesting, and I mean, I hope I'm right when I say that I think the maturity of the gay and lesbian movement is such that it won't just be, you know, doing for ourselves, but that we really will take our leadership in community building and our spirituality, a lot of it forged, but the extraordinarily, you know, having been in sort of the crosshairs of the right for so long, and by the loss of AIDS, what AIDS has done to our community, there has been a kind of a deepening on the values side. You know, what is life about? What is this country about? What is democracy about? So I see us providing leadership in other movements, is what I'm saying, is that as we step forward, as I hope that this coalition, but I think it's bigger than a coalition, I think it's reclaiming democracy. It's reclaiming this country.
It's funny that you've all kind of identified the potential to go sort of either way with this. We talk about this feeling of discouragement. And it's the same way with, you know, with an election. All this talk about bipartisanship. I am a bipartisan activist in Sacramento. But bipartisanship doesn't mean everything gets mushed together in the middle and there are no differences. There are differences. There are incredible ideological differences. And disagreeing on policy matters is not partisan. What it is sticking to what your constituents elected you to represent. You tell them what you're for, they vote for you, you be for it. whether you're Orrin Hatch or Barbara Boxer or whoever you are, that's what you're supposed to do, and it isn't about party. It's about values. But the question is, will our community and others be discouraged, make excuses, say, oh, there's nothing I can do, look, they took it over, or is there, you know, the sort of the energy? And the answer is, well, it could go either way. What do we do, however, if we're energized?
The thing that has changed from the movements of the 80s, and they were great movements, is that we now have entirely new mediums for communication, organizing, and activism. We could raise money quicker now. We could organize quicker. We could get the word out. We could cast a rapid response to the millions of people in the fraction of a second. And I think that whole dynamic, the new economy of activism, new activism, is the ability for us to take that diverse coalition. We're going to have your traditional liberals all of a sudden bond from a values-based point of view with the folks that were on the streets of Seattle at the World Trade Organization. You know, we're gonna see that, where in many cases they were seen as the left of the left. You know, now they're going to be seen as part of the left. Now they're going to be included, and that generation of activists are going to be able to bring a whole new set of dynamics that will help to operate and rapidly respond to some of the issues that will confront us from the Bush administration. The Bush administration, in my opinion, our old economy. These are folks that just good old boys and good old girls who come from, you know, these staunchy old Wall Street type and Houston-based types of companies that are not clearly understanding of the value that Mr. Greenspan perhaps saw in unleashing some of the new economy developments. And we see what happened last week with their pressure. They twisted his arm. And you know, they're claiming, and George Bush is going out there saying, heard some bad news from these executives. Well, what executives he's talking to? Old economy executives for the most part, and they're saying, yeah, there is a slowdown.
Well, but he's also smart to say, you know, it's not my fault. It's already started before I was there. It's just going down the tubes. And then, of course, if it goes down the tubes because of things he did, all he has to do is say, you know, see, I told you.
You know, I wanted to just raise this point about this kind of possible, kind of, in the best sense, kind of anti-old paradigm, anti-old corporate model, and just mention this article that's been whizzing around the email sort of cyberspace by John Kenneth Galbraith that's coming out in the Texas Observer about corporate democracy. And what he basically says is that what happened when you had basically the Republicans lost the election, and then they tried to obstruct the vote in order to you know, the vote count, in order to make sure that they got their guy in. And he said, you know, this isn't a new form. This is called corporate democracy. I'm going to read this. It is a system whereby a board of directors, read the Supreme Court, selects the chief executive officer, and then he in turn appoints new members of that board. You know, the shareholders are owners in title only. They're invited to cast their votes in periodic referenda, but their franchise is only symbolic. For management holds a majority of the proxies. On no important issue do the CEO and the board ever permit themselves to lose. And the media, which is kind of used to this form of corporate democracy, as Galbraith calls it, you know, kind of rolled over. And what he called for, which is really great to hear this, was for, as he put it, to never forget, you know, do not forget, over the next 4 years, do not forget that this election is, you know, a fraud, that in fact Al Gore won. It's a stolen election. And he calls for civil disrespect. I love it. It's not quite civil disobedience. He's not calling for us to go out on the streets in some random way, but for civil disrespect, where we don't allow any substantial policies, where the political space is not given to Bush and the Supreme Court to enact permanent kinds of changes, because it's not a legitimate government. And I love the idea. And in fact, I'm surprised just in my own friends and family, sort of the people, you know, we all have kind of our brother-in-law test, or our test with the people who are not political, you know, the ones that aren't the activists and don't read the paper every day, who maybe we check with to see what the bellwether, you know, like what's really happening, our fingers on the pulse. And I have to tell you that underneath this this media and Republican and spin doctors call for sort of let's everybody get in line and make peace now, time for a national healing. There's a lot of outrage, and there's a lot of people who know that this election was stolen, who know that this is not a legitimate presidency. He's a president-select and not a president-elect. And I think that if we do our organizing, and if we have good hearts, and if we're values-driven, and if we realize we're representing a majority opinions here, we're not at the margins. This should be a majority voice over the next 4 years, and we need to remember that. Not that there's anything wrong with being at the margins. I've been at them most of my life. But we really are talking about a social vision in this country that's shared by an awful lot of people, fragmented as we may have been over the last years by having to, fight against the right wing or fight for our individual rights. If we come together, I mean, I really think that there's a way that if we come from a place of this civil disrespect, it's civil, but it is disrespect in the sense that we're not going to let this guy promote his agenda without a battle against the majority of Americans.
I think it's a brilliant phrase, and as a matter of fact, I've seen it now in 3 different emails where people don't seem to know where it arose. And I think it's good for us to give credit to John Kenneth Galbraith. It's a brilliant article, and I think this is one of those cut and paste and forward. People are always forwarding me emails. I think it's a sign of friendship when you forward an email. This is something I thought of you. I wanted you, to have this. I'm interested in how your students are responding to this, John. We always talk about youth, and sometimes we mean high school youth or college or whatever, but young people. Do you see any outrage or any platitudes or whatever's happening with them?
Well, it's funny because I teach at both USC and at Whittier, and USC is in LA and Whittier is down in Orange County, where you would think that the students would be more conservative. I'm finding at both schools tremendous fascination with the whole process, tremendous interest and invigoration in the whole political discussion. Whereas 2 or 3 years ago, if you raised anything political, they would just gloss over their eyes. There has been so much attention on this election, and there's so much interest, and so many people. I had students who were from out of the state who made sure that they voted absentee, that they actually express mailed their ballot back so that it would get there in time. That kind of interest, which typically first-year law students who are so overwhelmed, they're not taking that kind of time. And one of the things that I've talked to them about is, how do you change this? How do you get involved? And I think that our movement really needs to return, in addition to fighting the battles at the national level, return to the local level. The state and local level is where change is really going to occur in the hearts and minds of people, and we need to experiment at the local level. When Reagan came into office, that was when West Hollywood became a city. And we enacted one of the first domestic partnership ordinances. At the same time as this tremendous conservative retrenchment at the federal level, we were able to enact domestic partnership. And that grew. Other cities copied it. It now has been enacted thanks to your leadership at the state level. And we've seen the growth of that concept. So now in Vermont, they have civil unions. I think that is where we're going to make any real gains, real progress, is by getting down and dirty at the local level, fighting for things that we feel are important for our community. I think that's where the progress is going to be.
Well, of course, we thought the states' rights were going to be respected by the Supreme Court. Now we're going to have to re-examine that assumption, or maybe it's only when there's just one issue at risk. Because the Supreme Court, on their equal protection analysis, it's always been very interesting. If you have a minority that is claiming they're not being treated equal, then for some reason the majority of this court has found that equal protection doesn't apply to that. If you have a white man who's being, discriminated against and brings an equal protection claim, that's when we're really saying, equal protection has been violated. I guess in that sense, they were consistent. But in terms of states' abilities to go beyond, which we have done in California on protecting people with disabilities at work beyond what the ADA provides, age discrimination beyond what the federal law provides, if they leave that avenue open to us, we can do it. But there are always problems where federal law, I shouldn't say problems, I mean it's appropriate under the Constitution where federal law maintains and they kind of occupy the field and we don't get a choice. I mean, we haven't talked about gun control issues, which I think is also, I mean, when the, you know, when Charlton Heston is packing his bags to move into the White House, I get a little concerned. But it does sound that the NRA was having that same sort of hearing the music playing behind, you know, what
yeah,
you're
there's
saying.
three. I was thinking that there are three areas we haven't mentioned, and one of them is, you know, there's been a resurgence of labor, and I mean, you got it. No matter what you think, and it's, you know, I don't think its record is 100% good, but no matter what you think of the labor movement, it's an anti-poverty machine. And with the new economy, the downside of the new economy is the increase in the gap between rich and poor, and you basically have sort of 40% of the people in this country working as low-wage workers, and you know, we get, and the top 1% has accrued most of the wealth of the last 20 years. And so, you know, the labor movement and the kind of resurgence that has happened under John Sweeney in the Bill Clinton administration, and it particularly here in California, the rise of new labor that's been so significant, and the, you know, the janitor strike and so forth. But there, I mean, there's Dick Cheney on Meet the Press saying the very first thing that they're going to do is make it less possible for labor union members to do that that checkoff where they, I mean, that is how to cut the knees out from under the labor movement that basically delivered Al Gore Michigan and Ohio and to some extent California. So labor's one. The other is immigration policy, which has not been particularly progressive over the last 6 or 8 years. But I heard there was just recently this like emergency meeting of 200 immigrants' rights groups here in Southern California to try to strategize, because it's just going to be, you know, horrendous in the future. And then of course the gun control issues, and now there's, you know, and I think that is definitely an issue where you have had the NRA lobby, the gun lobby has absolutely blocked, except for here in California, you know, a couple of other state levels. John says, I think what progress has been made in some of these tough issues where the right wing has had pretty much a lock on the national debate and on national policy, and because Clinton's had to operate in a political environment where the right wing, not just the Republicans, but the right wing of the Republican Party was in control of Congress, you know, for those critical years. And anyway, so I think there are other issues, and I really see these of a piece. I mean, for probably 20 years of my life, I really felt like the voice I had to be, you know, shouting and singing the loudest was my lesbian and, you know, feminist voice. And I really feel now as if I'm in the same boat with a lot of people who may not look like me and may not come from the same place, although my people were immigrants from Ireland, of course, at some point back there. But, you know, and I just feel like it's not just sort of a paper thing, you know, or a good idea. Let's build those coalitions that make everybody just come together. I really feel like it's a struggle for the soul of this country. And it's so clear now. I mean, it's just so clear who's running it. And it's an old group of guys with old values, and it doesn't bring out the best of what this country can be. We're either going to be a multicultural, pluralistic, tolerant country, and that's going to mean extending some economic democracy. It is going to mean we're going to have to relook at the social contract and the economic part of the social contract in light of the new economy, because it's leaving a lot of people behind. Or we're going to go backwards. And, you know, I think we've all said that, and you've said that. And in one way or another, we're kind of at a crossroads, and this will bring out the finest in us over the next 4 years and beyond. Or we'll kind of fall into that depression, we'll take even more Prozac and fall into our private lives and, you know, make the best that we can. Or we're going to come together and rebuild, you know, and work together.
Well, there's been an interesting cross-pollinization of the issues. Anyway, I was thinking we were talking about immigrants, how many years the battered women's movement worked in order to get immigration activists to understand that this ought to be a way in which where battered women are escaping violence, even though it's private and not government inspired, that this had to get into the lexicon of the immigration rights community because it's government sanctioned where there's no law against domestic violence. And finally, there was some opening there. The same thing with our partners, where we want to bring them in under immigration laws. Doesn't mean that the Democratic administration has been perfect. There's been a little bit of an opening. There's been a little bit of light. And of course, there's a great fear, not only that what the immigration rights community has as its core issues will be attacked, but those of us who've been trying to connect with the immigration rights community on battered women or gay and lesbian issues, where that's beginning to expand. What happens in a right-wing environment like this is you retrench back to your core values and say, I can't even get my stuff. Don't start bringing me stuff to make me educated.
That's what we have to avoid.
Yeah.
And because it's going to be critical for our overall movement, whether it's gay and lesbian, environmental, immigration, to see the greater good of being able to share that small core value with another sector of the movement, because that's what the right wing wants. They want to basically divide our front and then split us up and eliminate us, quite frankly. That's how you eliminate, we're all politicians. I mean, we know how to do that. And we're going to have to do it to them as well. But when you look at things like gun control and immigration, or I think the single greatest thing, if you want to really take it, boils down to what are going to be states' rights and federal rights and so forth. That's going to be a very big question, because they've turned the game around on themselves and on us, quite frankly. And it's not just on civil rights issues, where on a lot of environmental issues, it was commerce and trade seeking protection under federal interstate commerce clause, so that they could pollute in California, even though they were stationed here and commerced here. They were registered in Nevada, but they polluted here. And so, we at the Coalition for Clean Air years ago got them for that, but they continue to try federal preemption, and that's not right. And that this court is going to uphold a lot of that now. So we have to be concerned about these things. On the immigration issue, in addition to that great scenario that you outlined on abused women, is also the ability to finally get gay and lesbian rights written into as policy within the INS, that if they are persecuted on sexual orientation, then they deserve a fair hearing. And that was something that recently came out, and now we could begin to help to protect that. I guess that will probably be one of the first things that gets looked at in this administration. It's going to be we're going to be tearful, but there's also going to be some joyful periods of this, and that's because we're going to be able to get that spiritual connection between all the different sectors of our activist community involved and drive it toward a single objective, and that is basically, I think Gabrielle is just too kind. This was, in school we called this a coup d'etat. That's what it was. This is the overtaking of a government by an illegitimate means or by force. And that's what has happened here. It may have been a bloodless revolution, but it was a revolt nonetheless, and it was against the will of the people. To this day, Al Gore has more than 600,000 votes in the popular vote, and if it wasn't for the Supreme Court being an obstacle to allowing the vote to continue in Florida, just like Maria Cantwell won in Washington, so too would have Al Gore in Florida.
Well, that's what they want us to forget, though, and this issue about Galbraith saying, don't forget, is that, people, talk about the memes that got out in society, another email that was one of my favorites, that there are certain elements of knowledge or opinion or just thought that are put out, we call it spin, but it has to grab hold. And one of the ones that grabbed hold, they call them memes, just like your genes imprint who you are. These memes imprint what you think. And one of the early memes in Florida was put out by the right wing, which was, Bush won, why is Gore such a crybaby?
Right.
Let's give up, let's all just get on with our business. Well, no. Just say no. That's really what I've been saying to people. You can't say that, oh yeah, I guess so, that's legitimate. Well, yes, it is legitimate if a Supreme Court makes a decision that's brought to it, but that doesn't make an election in which you didn't count all the votes legitimate, and we're not going to stop saying that. That's not being a sore loser, that's simply being a truth teller, which
it's
of
legitimate,
course,
but it ain't
people
right.
hate,
I think that people are not going to forget, and I think unlike past elections where maybe people of color would feel excluded from the election, now there's a much broader group of people who feel like their voices weren't properly heard and counted properly. And I think there's going to be a much broader group of people who do not feel like this election was legitimate and do not feel like their voices were counted. They're going to continue to press forward. And I think in Florida we're going to see some changes at the state level and probably even at the governor's level.
New Voting Rights Act.
Yep.
Well, I'd love that Castro offered to come and help with those elections. I think that was totally appropriate.
What a nice guy.
I think, what a nice guy. I mean, some of
Love
my
those
friends have said,
fatigues.
why didn't we ask Jimmy Carter to go there?
Right.
You know, we send him to all those other elections. Well, of course, it's amazing, but the hour's already sort of spun by. I've had a wonderful time. Thank you, Torie. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
John.
Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you for joining us. We know that you have these same discussions around your dinner tables every day and night, and I hope you will continue to do so. And all I have to say to you is, as to the George W. Bush administration, don't get used to it.